and civil society groups in the federal member states, as well as with the federal executive and legislative branches and other key stakeholders. We briefed President Formaggio on our findings and emphasized the urgent need to resume dialogue. We and international partners stand ready to support this as required. While technical advances across political, security, economic, and humanitarian agendas have continued, I must underscore that these gains will quickly reach their limits without the necessary political agreements. I call on Somalia's leaders as a matter of urgency to meet and engage in dialogue on Somalia's national priorities. Mr. President, in 2020, Somalia will face a critical test of its state-building progress through the holding of historic one-person, one-vote elections. In recent years, Somalia has established a track record of regular, peaceful transfers of power. This commendable achievement must now be preserved in 2020. In addition, a move to one-person, one-vote elections will mean a shift from the elders-based selection of recent political cycles to direct voting by the people of Somalia. The new electoral code has now been approved by the House of the People and the Upper House and signed into law by the President. While an important step, the new law regrettably does not address many outstanding questions necessary to implement the code. These questions relate to the locations of constituencies, how to guarantee 30% of seats for women, and the modalities to enable Somalis from across the country to participate. I call on the federal parliament, in collaboration with the National Independent Electoral Commission and in consultation with the federal government, the federal member states, and other stakeholders, to resolve these issues urgently so that technical preparations can get underway. This must include the federal member states ensuring that the NIEC, National Independent Electoral Commission, can maintain offices across the country to organize elections. Elections must be held too in Somaliland, where parliamentary elections were last held in 2005. And I urge the authorities and all political actors to find a way through the current impasse for both parliamentary and local elections to take place in Somaliland before the end of 2020. Political space and debate will be an essential component in the year ahead in Somalia to enable candidates, journalists, civil society, and international partners to engage frankly in the political discourse. We especially look forward to hearing the voices of women, youth, and minorities in an open debate on Somalia's future. Continued efforts toward reconciliation will also be necessary to forge unity on Somalia's future. We call on political actors in Galmudug and Jubaland in particular to engage in dialogue, to refrain from violence, and to avoid divisions that will be exploited by al-Shabaab. We note recent security deployments in Jubaland's Ghetto region have led instead to increased tension. Mr. President, turning to the security situation, let me first pay tribute to the courage of the Somali National Army and the African Union mission in Somalia in confronting al-Shabaab. There has been steady, commendable progress in rebuilding Somalia's security institutions, including implementation of biometric registration, electronic payment of salaries for the security forces, and personnel records. Unfortunately, military operations have slowed since mid-2019, and force generation has, to date, not been sufficient for the tasks required in 2020, including priority operations against al-Shabaab and for reopening main supply routes. Despite efforts by the SNA, Somali National Army, AMISOM, and international partners, regrettably, al-Shabaab retains the ability to conduct large-scale attacks in Mogadishu, including against the UN and the international community, and in the recently recovered areas in Lower Shabelle. It is also able to generate significant revenue through extortion, as well as to conduct operations beyond Somalia's borders. It is essential that the Somali government clarify its operational priorities and generate the necessary forces to enable operations to degrade al-Shabaab, defend recently recovered areas, and reopen main supply routes. These must be conducted with respect for human rights and sequenced with the return of legitimate local governance, rule of law, and stabilization activities in order to be sustainable. AMISOM has committed to implement the reduction of 1,000 soldiers by February 28th, as decided by the Security Council in Resolution 2472. Prior to the drawdown, the Somali government, AMISOM, and UNSOM prepared a joint threat assessment as requested by the Council and by the African Union Peace and Security Council. AMISOM remains essential to security under current circumstances, but it is also time to begin inclusive discussions on the strategic outlook and requirements to enable AMISOM to progressively hand over security ownership to the Somali authorities in a manner that preserves hard-won gains while achieving greater strategic effect against al-Shabaab. Mr. President, vulnerable Somalis continue to face extreme humanitarian challenges. Back-to-back droughts, flooding, conflict, and insecurity have left 5.2 million people in Somalia in need of assistance. This was before the worst locust outbreak Somalia has experienced in 25 years. The Food and Agriculture Organization is supporting the government to mitigate the potentially catastrophic impact on food security. I call on donors to urgently provide funding and support for the 2020 Humanitarian Response Plan. Longer term, we must align behind the Somali government's National Development Plan to advance humanitarian development and peace-building goals. Regional cooperation is essential to address the many challenges in the Horn of Africa. I welcome efforts by the President and regional leaders to resolve differences and strengthen ties. In this regard, we note that Ethiopian President Abiy Ahmed earlier this month arranged a meeting between President Farmajo and Somaliland President Musa Bihi Abdi. We look forward to their further engagement with a view to constructive dialogue. Mr. President, there is much to do in the year ahead. Only by working together as Somalis, as partners, and in a spirit of unity and compromise will progress be made. Further impetus and consensus building are needed to ensure that key 2020 benchmarks for elections, security, and relations between the federal government and federal member states do not fall further behind schedule. I look forward to Somalia's leaders taking the bold steps necessary to enable such progress in this critical year. I also look forward to the United Nations continuing to play its role through full implementation of the mandate authorized by this Council. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Swan for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Francisco Madeira.
Mr. President, this is a crucial year for Somalia, a year in which the country is expected to deliver on pressing national priorities. Inclusive politics, elections, debt relief, and the advancement of the transition plan are just some among the most immediate of these priorities. So far, the signs are positive, despite the many challenges. On 25th August 2019, with the support of the international community and partner organizations, after due consultations with the federal government of Somalia and Galmudug authorities, AMISOM deployed forces into Samareb with the purpose of helping create a reassuring atmosphere for the reconciliation conference to take place and in order to support the establishment of security conditions for the ensuing electoral process to evolve in a peaceful and violence-free environment. The successful holding of the federal government's promoted Galmudug Reconciliation Conference resulted in the stakeholders agreeing on the modalities for the election. The state formation effort was given a boost with the successful conclusion of the negotiations regarding the quota of parliamentary seats to be reserved for Al-Sunnah wa Jama'ah. This opened the way for the state electoral process to begin and the election of the 89-member strong state assembly and other organs of the state to take place. We made it clear then, and make it clear now, that the election was just one step in the right direction among many that are required. The reality on the ground in Galmudug and the paralysis of state institutions demand that the primacy of politics remains at the forefront of all the efforts that are being carried out to make Galmudug a functioning state again, a viable federal member state capable of achieving sustainable peace and the ability to provide for its people. In this context, the inclusive politics momentum that was gathered with the successful holding of Galmudug Reconciliation Conference should be harnessed and enhanced. It should not be lost. A lot still remains to be done to make Galmudug a strong, vibrant, and reconciled society. We therefore urge the leadership of Galmudug to continue to work in earnest to ensure that no genuine Galmudug stakeholder is alienated and that all the 11 clans that constitute the state of Galmudug have a guaranteed place around the table where their future is being shaped and their destiny sealed. It is therefore important that we, international partners engaged with helping Somalia overcome its present challenges, continue to work in earnest to encourage the Somali people to embrace and emulate the spirit and letter of the Dusamarebe Reconciliation Conference and ensure that genuine dialogue and harmonious interaction are established between the leadership of the federal member states and their communities and between the federal government of Somalia and the government of the federal member states. It is AMISOM's strong belief that this multifaceted interaction, if supported, harnessed, and sustained, will unlock the immense reconciliation capacity of the Somali people, the most assured pathway to sustainable peace in Somalia. We applaud the federal government's continued commitment to fostering dialogue among the Somali people, as demonstrated by the recent meeting between President Mohamed Abdullahi Farmajo and Mr. Musa Bihi of Somaliland in the margins of the 33rd African Union Assembly early this month. This is a very encouraging development and a source of great hope for the future of Somalia. Mr. President, as I noted earlier, Somalia is embarking on an important year, and one of the most important priorities this year is the organization of peaceful and credible national suffrage for the election of members of the federal parliament and that of the federal president. The fact that Somalia's federal electoral law has been approved by the House of the People and signed into law by President Farmajo a few days ago is an important and very positive development. We at AMISOM recognize that there are still a number of important issues to be ironed out to ensure unhindered and smooth implementation of the electoral law, but remain optimistic and confident that the momentum gained in the last 2 months will continue and that whatever obstacles may stand on the way of the elections in the last quarter of this year will be successfully overcome. For this, a lot of responsibility has been placed in the hands of the National Independent Electoral Commission and Madame Alima, its chair. It is our duty to support her in this endeavor by providing the Commission with the commensurate material and financial resources it will need, the security and mobility that will be indispensable for an effective delivery of the election, and the expertise it will require, both in terms of regular electoral staff as well as specialized personnel. We at the African Union reaffirm our continued readiness to support this process both technically and in terms of security. We are galvanized, Mr. President, by the tenacity, steadfastness, and the resilience with which the federal government of Somalia has been implementing its commitments to the terms agreed with the Bretton Woods institutions. This capacity to stay the course against all odds is now paying off. Somalia has met the required benchmarks under the SMP4 with regards to domestic revenue mobilization, public financial management, financial sector stability and compliance with anti-money laundering and combating the financing of terrorism. As a result, early this month, the IMF and the World Bank agreed that Somalia is now eligible for assistance under the Enhanced HIPC initiative. We congratulate the federal government of Somalia for this great achievement. Mr. President, the recently concluded threat assessment indicates that Al-Shabaab remains resilient and retains the capacity to carry out attacks against Somali security forces, AMISOM, and innocent civilians, mostly using improvised explosive devices, mortars, and targeted assassinations. In a concerted effort to degrade and contain the enemy, AMISOM and partners continue to support the Somali security forces with the ground and air operations, focusing on Al-Shabaab's presence and activities in Middle Shabelle, Lower Shabelle, Middle Juba, and Mogadishu. The implementation of the transition plan remains the rallying point of our mandated tasks towards 2021. Our operations in this regard are confronted with challenges related to the slow pace in the generation and equipping of Somali security forces, lack of sustained ISR capability service, and inadequate logistics support to the Somali National Army. As mandated by this Council under Resolution 2472/2019, AMISOM is required to draw down another 1,000 of its troops, the third batch since 2018. This is a task that is ongoing and will be completed by 28 February. The drawdown will be on a pro rata basis. There will be, however, consideration for threat assessment when reconfiguring the remaining forces within our sectors. Mr. President, the current politics of drawdown are in complete mismatch with the reality obtaining in the theater of operations. The process of generating adequate, well-trained, well-equipped, and logistically well-supported Somali forces to take over security responsibilities from AMISOM is not in tandem with the targets and timelines we have set for ourselves in the transition plan. The process is slow, underfunded, profoundly dependent on the goodwill of individual partners, with no shared and coordinated training plans and no evident correlation with the need to timely generate forces capable of taking full security responsibility from AMISOM and allow the completion of the current transition by 2021. As a result, the AMISOM forces that, per the transitional plan and CONOPS, are supposed to be reconfigured into more flexible and more mobile forces capable of sustainably going out, take on and degrade the enemy, are the same forces that are currently still holding the bulk of the population centers they have liberated from Al-Shabaab. In this context, the operations they can undertake against the enemy cannot go beyond a limited distance from the population centers they are holding. This negatively conditions the task of securing the main supply routes, the pursuit of the enemy to its strongholds, and the capturing and holding of new territory from Al-Shabaab. The Security Council may wish to look more closely into the reality that is confronting our forces and those of the Federal Republic of Somalia in the theater of operations and consider additional measures that need to be taken to allow pressure to be exerted on Al-Shabaab in a sustainable, consistent, and relentless manner so that the enemy is effectively degraded and the Lower Shabelle-like successful joint operations are extended to much wider Somali territorial expanses. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Mr. Madeira for his briefing. I now give the floor to Mr. Dan Smith.
Mr. President, Excellencies, thank you for the opportunity to speak to you today about the effect of climate-related impact on peace operations in Somalia. This is a glimpse into the world of tomorrow in which peace operations will be undertaken in security environments that are increasingly influenced by climate and vulnerable to its vagaries. The mandate renewals in 2018 and 2019 for the United Nations Assistant Mission in Somalia referred to the impact of climate change. Against that background, my institute, the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, SIPRI, has explored the evidence of climate impact, assessed the risks it poses, and identified responses. We released our report in late 2019, and my presentation today summarizes its findings. In brief, floods and droughts in Somalia exacerbate conflict and displacement. Thereby, UNSOM's efforts and the work of the federal government of Somalia in building peace risk being undermined. The pressure of weather events is part of what challenges the current power-sharing agreement, providing recruitment opportunities for the Al-Shabaab terrorist organization, among others. Turning that round, so responding to climate variability creates opportunities for peace building, is perhaps the essence of the challenge facing the federal government of Somalia and UNSOM. Addressing the negative impact of environmental change on peace operations could offer an opportunity to build a positive relationship between environmental resilience and sustainable peace. I don't need to explain to the Council the contours of conflict in Somalia. Conflicts persist among competing clans and ideological and political groups. There are both national and local conflicts feeding each other. The local conflicts are often closely linked with access to natural resources, especially land, fisheries, and water. The ownership of resources is closely linked to livelihoods and ways of life, and thus to markers of communal identity. This makes conflict particularly hard to resolve or even manage, and embeds the influence of climate deep within the factors that shape the prospects of security and insecurity, peace or conflict in Somalia. So let us turn to the country's climate. Mr. President, our report does not argue that climate defines everything in Somalia or elsewhere. But the evidence is that if your analysis leaves out nature, including climate, then the analysis is incomplete. Somalia experiences some of the world's highest mean annual temperatures and has long been prone to extreme weather conditions. In the 6 decades since 1960, the country has experienced a gradual and continuous increase in mean annual temperature. While the conflicts have made data collection and tracking difficult, in 2007, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, projected a temperature increase of between 3.2 and 4.3 degrees centigrade by the end of this century, far exceeding tolerable levels. Meanwhile, rainfall is erratic and varies widely between the seasons and from year to year. In 2014, the IPCC projected more rain for Somalia in the coming decades, with the rain falling more intensely, thus generating a high and growing risk of flooding and soil erosion. Consequently, seasons and weather are hard to predict. This uncertainty has a direct impact on everyday life in a population that is highly dependent on agriculture for their livelihoods. It intensifies competition for natural resources and generates conflicts, because as herders shift away from traditional grazing routes due to unexpectedly changed conditions, so farmers find themselves having to defend their land and crops against extra pressure. Herders are more inclined to sell livestock in times of extreme weather. This depresses local prices, weakening an already weak market, which closes options for a dignified livelihood for young men. It thus
indirectly encourages criminality and creates opportunities for recruitment by armed factions. In short, local climate realities feed al-Shabaab with a pool of potential recruits. And of course, the influx of small arms into the region offers armed factions additional opportunities for building their strength. Further, local conflicts can quickly escalate to national level. Disagreements on natural resources are absorbed into Somalia's larger political dynamics and have led to some of its deadliest violence. And worryingly, at the same time as resource-based conflicts have both deepened and escalated, migration to the cities and internal displacement have had the effect of weakening traditional means of managing and resolving conflicts. So, Mr. President, the evidence is clear that climate-related shocks and stresses can destabilize Somalia's prospects for peace. Extreme weather events create water and food insecurity that give al-Shabaab the opportunity to act as service providers. This allows their political narrative to gain support and decreases trust in the peace-building efforts of the federal government of Somalia and the UN. UNSOM and the UN country team have responded to the increasing pressure and recurrence of extreme weather events and their knock-on effects. And learning from the 2011 drought and its catastrophic consequences, initiatives were developed that curbed the potentially severe famine in 2016 and 2017. The key was timely information and effective interagency cooperation across Somalia. This is the basis for forming the Disaster Operation Coordination Centre, working with a comprehensive recovery and resilience framework for Somalia. It's also important that the role of an environmental security advisor was created so as to address the need for coordination. So, UNSOM is taking steps to address climate-related risks. Together with the UN country team, what more can it do? One, it can focus on improving coordination between the government and humanitarian and security actors, both Somali and international. To be sure, care must be taken not to undermine humanitarian neutrality, but assistance in a humanitarian emergency can be accepted from different quarters. A preparation for this will reduce the impact of future shocks and can be done without compromising humanitarian principles. Two, it can remain alert to the need to adapt its response structures to evolving conditions. Part of its long-term strategy and part of the recovery and resilience framework for Somalia should be to build the capacity to receive, process, disseminate, and act upon information that reflects the changing on-the-ground realities in the dual context of a changing climate and protracted conflicts. Three, climate and climate change cross national boundaries, and so does the impact. Broader regional responses are required. Through the African Union and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, appropriate interstate frameworks exist with which UNSOM can cooperate. Mr. President, if I may, our report also contains relevant input for similar United Nations missions in vulnerable areas. So 4, the case of UNSOM in Somalia exemplifies what we have also identified in other operations in the Sahel, in the Middle East and in Asia, the imperative of preparing now for climate impacts. The first step is to increase capacity to assess climate-related security risks. A good starting point is to step up dialogue on this among UN agencies working in country. It is, or should be, a central plank of the sustaining peace and conflict prevention agenda. 5, by increasing information exchange between missions, knowledge about what works and what does not will be brought together and can be more widely shared. And 6, dare we say it, dare to find new responses. Some tried and tested measures are still relevant, but all other things being equal, a changing world requires some new responses. Knowing what does not work means it's time to find something new, even experimentally. And finally, Mr. President, there are implications for the wider UN system. To synthesize climate risk assessment capacity. Risk assessment information should be made available to those that need it via the UN system and the climate security mechanism. To ensure the training of peace-building personnel includes a specific focus on climate sensitivity. And lastly, to carry out the systems adjustments needed so that funding streams can support integrated responses to climate-related security risks and prioritize programs that promote climate resilience. In sum, Mr. President, Excellencies, the case of Somalia shows us the future of peace-building. There are practical steps decision-makers can take to address the negative impact of today's environmental crises to improve tomorrow's prospects for peace and security. UNSOM and the federal government of Somalia have both made important steps in this direction, and there is room for more. Thank you for the opportunity to address you, and thank you for your attention.
Je remercie Monsieur.
I thank Mr. Smith for his briefing. I now give the floor to those council members who wish to make statements, and I begin by giving the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom.
Much, Mr. President. May I also thank our briefers. I thought Dan Smith's presentation was particularly interesting. I think it's a helpful reminder that it is rarely the case, and certainly not in Somalia, that all of a country's problems can be fixed through a sort of top-down political process in smoke-filled rooms in a capital city, and that actually a bottom-up, community-based, wider contextual understanding is important. And I thought your point around the need for this council, as it thinks about conflict prevention, which is something that we, I think, struggle with sometimes, to be thinking about climate risk as part of that, as part of the data input, was really an important one as well, and I hope we can take that forward collectively. Mr. President, let me start with one of the most positive developments recently and congratulate the government of Somalia on reaching the major milestone of eligibility for debt relief under the Highly Indebted Poor Country Initiative. And let me commend the cooperation between the federal government and the federal member states on the financial reforms which have enabled this. It's vital now that that cooperation between the federal government and the federal member states deepens and extends to political and security reform, which will allow Somalia to fulfill the criteria necessary for debt relief. Let me also welcome the recent enactment of the electoral law, which President Farmajo noted was and I quote, a chance to execute democratic rights for one person, one vote in the forthcoming 2021 elections, unquote. But this is only the first step. There are essential aspects of the elections which are still unresolved, and we are concerned about spoilers trying to push the process off track. So it is vital, Mr. President, that the Somali Parliament takes urgent steps to make progress on the passage of the amendments to the Political Parties Act, which will allow parties to register for the elections, and to address other unresolved questions in the electoral law, including the definition of constituencies, the allocation of seats to constituencies, how the 30% quota of seats for women, to which Somalia has committed, will be implemented, and management of seats in Benadir and Somaliland. These questions need to be answered in order to make the electoral law technically implementable and fundable if we are to deliver peaceful, inclusive, credible and transparent one person, one vote elections in line with the Provisional Constitution of Somalia. Mr. President, we regret that the National Independent Election Commission, or NIEC, is unable to operate freely in all federal member states. The NIEC is an independent and impartial technical body empowered by the Constitution, and we call on Somali authorities at all levels to cooperate fully with the NIEC, to permit the registration of political parties, and to take steps to ensure media freedoms. Now, Mr. President, if that is an example of one of the problems currently facing us in Somalia, we believe that the resolution comes principally through dialogue and cooperation between the federal government of Somalia and the federal member states. It is simply essential to a peaceful and agreed process for the transition of power. Elections are a crucial step towards a political settlement in Somalia and a broader constitutional review. And so we call on the federal government and the federal member states to engage constructively and urgently in consensus building to agree how the electoral model will be implemented. Mr. President, to ensure broader stability in Somalia, we urge all stakeholders in Galmudug state to engage in dialogue on local reconciliation to preserve the significant efforts and progress of the last 7 months. We are concerned that a divided Galmudug with multiple claims to leadership will be harder to govern, and compromise must be made to avoid the risk of instability and conflict. We also urge all parties in Jubaland to ease tensions and address differences through dialogue and compromise. Now, Mr. President, let me turn to security and security reforms. We're at a critical juncture in discussions on the long-term future of international support to Somali security and how we support Somalia in taking the lead. This Council mandated an independent review of Somali security after 2021, and we urge regional partners to engage in consultations with Somalia, with the United Nations, with the African Union, to help deliver a joint and unified solution for a post-2021 security model in Somalia. Rapid progress on security reforms is vital, including commitment to the delivery of the Somalia-led transition plan and the implementation of the national security architecture. And it's crucial that the drawdown of AMISOM troops this month happens in line with the threat assessments on the ground. Last time round, this approach wasn't taken and it had a negative impact, so better consultation is important. We remain concerned by the ongoing climate and conflict-induced humanitarian crisis. The current desert locust crisis in Somalia and the wider region is extremely worrying, and the United Kingdom is coordinating closely with partners to limit the locust infestation and mitigate the impact of crop losses through surveillance and spraying operations. We call on the international community to provide more funding for the humanitarian response and to step up efforts to build resilience and long-term climate mitigation initiatives in Somalia. And I would just note, over the last 12 months, the UK has given over $400 million to the various humanitarian, political and security requirements in Somalia. Finally, let me pay tribute to the United Nations for its continued support under the SRSG to Somalia. Let me pay tribute to the ongoing commitment and sacrifices of AMISOM troop-contributing countries and, of course, of the Somali National Security Forces in the fight against al-Shabaab. They are brave and tenacious men and women who are fighting for not only Somali security, but for the region and for all of us. Somalia and its international supporters face a huge task in the coming years in delivering inclusive national elections and a transition to Somali-led security. The UK will continue to stand firmly alongside Somalia, the United Nations, the African Unions in these efforts. But without substantial progress, both on elections and on consensus building between the different levels of government, there is a risk that our next discussion of Somalia will be a much more difficult discussion. So let's do everything we can to prevent that from happening. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you, Special Representative Swan, for your briefing today. The United States deeply appreciates your commitment to advancing security, stability, and development in Somalia. I also thank the other two briefers for their briefings today as well. Mr. President, 2020 is a critical year as Somalia seeks economic growth and development promised by debt relief, inclusive, peaceful, and credible national elections, and progress towards the transfer of security responsibilities from AMISOM to Somali forces. While these developments each hold tremendous promise for the Somali people, realizing them will require the full commitment of the government and the people of Somalia.